There is a kind of quiet that a guardsman learns to read the way a farmer reads a sky. It is not the silence of an empty room. It is the silence of a room that is full of people who have all decided, at the same instant, to stop breathing. I have stood post in the royal house of Harrogate for 19 years, and I have heard that silence perhaps a dozen times. I heard it that afternoon in the long orangery, and I want to set down here exactly what happened, because a man's honor was made to hang on it, and because the one who bore the weight of it was a better man than I have words to describe. His name was Havard. I will call him that from the first line to the last, and I will not soften anything, because he would not have wanted it softened. He was 2 years my junior in service and a head taller, with the sort of face that a sculptor would have cut for a monument and then set aside as too severe. When Havard stood his post, you could hang a plumb line from the peak of his bearskin to the toe of his boot and not find a hair's breadth of sway in it. Tourists used to test him at the outer gate, a whistle, a shout, a girl blowing him a kiss, and he gave them nothing, not a flicker, not the ghost of a swallow. That was his gift and his discipline. What I want you to understand before I tell the rest is that the gift was never the point. The point was what the discipline was asterisk for asterisk. It was the 3rd week of the morning half-year, and the house had gathered to do a small, exact thing. The late Queen Isolde, the king's first wife, the mother of the crown prince and of Princess Elara, dead these 3 years of a fever that no physician could name, had left behind a garden. Not the great state gardens that the public walks on feast days. A smaller one, a walled square off the east wing that she had planted with her own hands in the last years of her health, white roses, a row of espaliered pear, a sundial of green marble, and a shallow reflecting channel that ran the length of it so that on a still day the sky lay in the ground like a second sky. She had called it in her private way the quiet garden. In her will she had asked that on the 3rd anniversary of her death the house gather there, and read aloud the names of the servants and gardeners and old retainers who had served her line, not the great names, the small ones, and that a bronze plaque be set at the head of the channel bearing those names, so that the least of her household would be remembered by the greatest. It was a Princess Elara thing to honor, and she had taken it up as a daughter takes up her mother's unfinished sewing. For a month she had worked with the clerks of the household to find every name, the woman who had nursed her as an infant, the man who had kept the Queen's horses, the 2 under-gardeners who had dug the channel and lined it with stone and were both long dead. She had the plaque cast. She had the roses cut back and tied. And because the quiet garden was too small to hold the whole house at once, she had arranged the reading to happen in 2 parts. First the naming in the long orangery, the glass gallery that opened onto the garden, and then the walk out to set the plaque in its place. Havard was posted at the garden door of the orangery that day. I was posted at the inner arch, 30 feet from him, and so I saw everything he saw, and I will not pretend I saw it better than he did, because I did not. But 2 witnesses are worth more than 1, and that fact, before this is over, is going to matter more than anything else I write. Understand who was in that room. The king was not. He was abroad on a state matter and expected back in 2 days, and his absence is the hinge on which the whole afternoon turned, because when the king is in the house behaves, and when he is out of it certain people remember that they had, all along, only been behaving. The Crown Prince Rowan was present, standing near the tall middle window with his hands behind his back, grave and quiet as he always was in his mother's memory. Princess Elara stood at the reading lectern, with the roll of names in her hand. Beside her, a step back and a step to the side, exactly where a woman of the old school stands when she means to lend her strength to another without stealing her light, stood Princess Adela, the king's sister, in dove gray, her chin level, her eyes moving over the room the way a shepherd's eyes move over a field before dark. And scattered through the gallery were perhaps 40 souls, the household clerks, the senior servants, a handful of lords and their ladies, and the 3 royal children Malin, who was 9 and holding her Aunt Elara's spare shawl as though it were a duty of state; Torin, who was 11 and standing very straight because he had been told this was a solemn day; and little Bram, 6, who had already been given a white rose to hold and was turning it over and over to look at the underside of the petals. And there was Lord Cassius. I will try to be fair to him, because a witness who is not fair is no witness at all. Lord Cassius was the son of the Queen Consort Morwenna, the king's second wife, by a first marriage, and so he was a stepson to the king and no blood at all to the late Queen Isolde, whose memory the room had gathered to keep. He was perhaps 30, well-made, with the confident carriage of a man who has never in his life had a door held shut against him. He had a good tailor and a better opinion of himself, and he had come to the reading, I think, for the same reason a certain kind of man goes to any gathering, to be seen at it, and to be seen as somehow above it. He arrived late, which in that room on that day was its own small insult, and he came down the length of the orangery with the unhurried step of a man who assumes the proceedings will wait for him. And because he was who he was, they did wait, a beat, an awful beat, while Elara held the roll and did not begin. She began anyway. She had a low, clear voice, Princess Elara, the kind that carries without being raised, and she read the first name, Aldith Morrow, who kept the Queen's linens for 40 years, and let it settle and read the next. It was very simple and it was very beautiful. 40 names, each a small life, each spoken once into a glass room full of light so that it would not be entirely gone from the world. I have stood a great many ceremonies in that house, gold plate and trumpets and crowns, and I tell you that the naming of 40 dead servants by a princess in a plain gray morning gown was worth more than all of them, and everyone in that room knew it. That was the quiet I told you about at the start. It began to gather even then, the good kind, the kind that comes when people are moved. Lord Cassius did not sit. There were chairs at the sides for the elderly, and he stood in the center aisle, a little forward of where he ought, and after the 8th or 9th name he did a thing that I noticed and that Havard, I would learn, noticed too. He took out a small folded paper and looked at it, and looked at Elara, and looked at the paper again, and his jaw set in the particular way a man's jaw sets when he has decided he is about to be important. The reading came to a natural pause. Elara reached the end of the household staff and turned the page to the gardeners, and in that pause, before she could draw the next breath, Lord Cassius spoke. "Forgive me, cousin." He was not her cousin, not in any real degree, but he used the word like a hand laid on a shoulder. "This is a lovely gesture, truly, but I wonder if we've all been given the correct list." You could feel the room change. Not much. A ripple, a cooling. Elara looked up from the roll, and to her enormous credit her face did not change at all. "The list is the Queen's own," she said, "in her will." "Of course it is," he smiled. "And I mean no disrespect to a will 3 years cold, but wills are administered by clerks, and clerks make errors, and I've had it on good authority." He lifted the folded paper an inch, as if it were a warrant, that at least 4 of these names never served the late Queen at all. Pensioners of another house, charges to the treasury under a name that isn't owed. It would be an embarrassment, wouldn't it, to cast them in bronze at the head of Her Majesty's garden and have it come out later. A pity. So I think, before we go any further, the reading should stop, and the list should be handed to me, and my people will verify it properly, and will reconvene when it's clean. There it was. Said pleasantly, said with a smile, said in the voice of a man doing everyone a favor. And it was, if you took it apart, 4 separate wrongs folded into one soft package. It called the late Queen's own testament careless. It called the princess who had spent a month over it a fool who couldn't count. It put a whisper of fraud, charges to the treasury under a name that isn't owed, into a room full of honest household servants who had come to weep for their friends. And it ended by demanding that the roll, the actual paper in the actual hand of the actual daughter, be surrendered to him, so that he might stand at the head of the ceremony as the man who cleaned up the mess. He was not correcting an error. He was seizing the day. He was reaching, in front of 40 witnesses, to take the ceremony out of Elara's hands and put it into his own, and to dress the theft as a service. I have stood in that house long enough to see a great many bids for power, and most of them are made in corridors, in the dark, in a murmur. This one was made in the light, at a lectern, over the names of the dead. That is what made it the worst I ever saw. For a moment nobody moved. Elara's hand tightened on the roll. I saw the paper crease, and I saw her weigh it. She could argue, and be seen arguing at her mother's memorial, which was exactly the mud he wanted her dragged into. Or she could yield the list to keep the peace, and let the reading die and let him win. 2 bad roads. The whole cruelty of what he'd done was that both roads led to him. And then Princess Adela stepped forward. 1 step. From behind Elara's shoulder to beside it, so that she stood level with her, the two of them shoulder to shoulder at the lectern, the young princess and the old, and I swear the light in the orangery seemed to change with that single step, the way it changes when a cloud moves off the sun. Lord Cassius. Princess Adela did not raise her voice either. She had been raising royal children and burying royal husbands, and holding this house together through 3 reigns before he was born, and she did not need to raise her voice for anything. You have a paper in your hand. Bring it to me. He had not expected that. He had expected the young princess to fold or to flail. He had not budgeted for the old one to simply hold out her hand. Aunt, he said, and the word cost him, you could hear it cost him, I'd rather my own people. Bring it to me, said Adela, or put it back in your pocket and be silent and let the daughter read her mother's names in peace. Those are the 2 roads open to you. Choose one. She had turned his own trap around and handed it back to him. Now he had 2 bad roads, and I watched Lord Cassius, in front of 40 people, discover that he could not think of a third. He should have walked to her. If he had walked to her and put the paper in her hand, whatever was on it, the afternoon would have ended differently and I would have no story to tell. But a man who has never had a door held shut does not know how to stand in a doorway that will not open. His face went from white to a mottled red, and his hand, the one holding the paper, closed into a fist that crushed the paper, and he took a step not toward Adela but toward Elara, and he said, "Lo, not for the room now but for the 2 women in front of him," in a voice I had to strain to catch, and Havard, closer, caught whole. "You think this little pantomime protects you. It doesn't. When my mother is the only queen this house remembers, none of you will have a garden to hide in." Then he grabbed the roll. I want to be exact about this, because the whole matter turned on it, and because men afterward tried very hard to make it into something smaller than it was. He did not ask again. He did not wait. He reached across the space between them and closed his hand over the top half of the roll of names, Elara's own hand still on the lower half, and he pulled. It was not a gentle taking. It was a wrench. The Princess Elara was pulled forward off her balance a full step, her shoulder dipping, a small cry of surprise driven out of her, and the old paper, the roll she had worked a month over, the names of 40 dead servants written out in her own hand, tore. It tore straight across, from the top edge nearly to the bottom, with a sound in that silent glass room like a slap. Half the names stayed in Elara's fist. Half of them crumpled into his. And in the instant after the tear, 3 things happened almost together, and I saw all 3, and Havard saw all 3, and this is the part I will swear to until the day I am carried out of this house feet first. The first thing, Princess Elara, off balance and gripping the ruined half of her mother's roll, did not scream and did not strike back. She caught herself on the edge of the lectern, straightened, and looked at Lord Cassius with an expression I have never forgotten, not fury, though she had every right to fury. Grief. She looked at him the way you look at a man who has broken something that cannot be mended, and she said very quietly, "Those are her names. You've torn her names." The second thing, Princess Adela moved between them. She put her own body, a woman past 60 in a dove-gray gown, squarely between Lord Cassius and her niece, one hand going back to steady Elara and the other coming up, palm out, level with his chest, not touching him, just there, a wall the height of a princess. "Stop," she said, and it was not loud, but it went through that room like a bell. "You will stand back from her. Now." And the third thing, the thing that turned a shameful scene into the matter that would go all the way to the king, was that Lord Cassius, red-faced, furious, humiliated at having been made small in front of 40 people by 2 women he had come to lord over, brought his crumpled fistful of paper up and back, and for one held breath it looked to every soul in that orangery as though he meant to bring the back of that fist across the old princess's face. He did not do it. Let me be exact, the blow was never struck. Whether he caught himself, or whether he only meant to threaten, or whether the sight of Adela's unmoving eyes stopped his arm, I cannot see into a man's heart, and I will not pretend to. What I can tell you is what a room full of witnesses saw. A grown lord raised hand, the king's own sister standing her ground before him, and a held breath in which nobody in that place knew whether it would fall. That was the breath in which Havard moved. You must understand what a guardsman is trained to do, and far more, what he is trained not to do. We do not touch the royal family. We do not seize a lord. A ceremonial guard at a memorial reading is a fixture, a piece of the architecture. His rifle is at his shoulder, and his eyes are forward, and the last thing in the world he is meant to become is a participant. Havard had stood that garden door for 4 hours without so much as shifting his weight. And when Lord Cassius's hand came up behind the Princess Adela, Havard crossed 30 feet of orangery floor in the time it takes to read this sentence, and he did not touch the Lord, and he did not raise his rifle, and he did not shout. He simply arrived. He put himself at Adela's shoulder, half a step in front of her, 6 feet and 4 inches of ceremonial guard in a red wool tunic and a black bearskin, and he stood there, eyes forward, exactly as still as he had been at the door, but now the stillness was between the raised hand and the princess's, and it was not architecture anymore. It was a decision. For a moment the lord's fist hung in the air, an arm's length from the guardsman's chest. And Havard said the only words he spoke in that whole afternoon, spoken quietly, spoken forward, not even turning his head, "My lord, there are children in this room." That was all. There are children in this room. He did not say put your hand down. He did not say how dare you. He gave the lord a door, a way to lower his arm that was not surrender to a guardsman but simple decency in front of the young ones. And he named the witnesses that mattered most. Little Bram with his white rose, Torrin standing very straight, Malin clutching the shawl, all 3 of them staring at their raised-fisted stepbrother with the wide, frozen eyes of children who have just learned that the grown world is not safe. Lord Cassius lowered his hand. He lowered it slowly, and he made his face into something that was trying to be contempt, and he said, "Get away from me, you painted toy." And he shoved past Havard's shoulder, a real shove, both hands, and Havard gave a half step and no more, the way a doorpost gives, and he walked the length of the orangery and out the far arch, the crumpled half of Isolde's name still in his fist, and he was gone. And the long orangery let out its breath. Princess Elara sat down. She had not meant to. Her knees simply stopped holding her, and Malin was there in an instant with the shawl, and Adela had her by the shoulders, and the household clerks were crowding forward, and the whole careful ceremony had come apart like the roll of paper itself, half in one hand and half in another. Bram began quietly to cry, and Torrin, 11 years old and trying so hard to be a man about a thing no man could have been ready for, put his arm around his little brother and said, "It's all right, Bram. The guard stopped him," which was not quite true and was also the truest thing said in that room all day. Havard had already stepped back. That is the thing about him I most want you to see. The instant Cassius was through the arch, Havard returned to his post at the garden door, resumed his stillness, put his eyes forward, and became once more a fixture, a piece of the architecture, as though he had never crossed the floor at all. He did not look to see if he'd be thanked. He did not look at me. He had done the one thing his oath demanded, and not 1 inch more. And now he was a guardsman again. And if you had walked into the orangery 1 minute later, you would have thought nothing had happened but a lady taken faint. Crown Prince Rowan crossed the floor to his sister. I heard him ask her low if she was hurt, and I heard her say no, and I heard him look at the torn roll in her hands and go very still and very cold in the way that the king goes still and cold because he is his father's son. He said, "Who saw this?" And Adela said, "Everyone in this room saw it." And Rowan said, "Then it will not be his word against yours." And that "it will not be his word against yours" is the first hint I had that the afternoon was not over. It was, in fact, barely begun. Because a bid for power made in the light over the names of the dead does not simply end when the man who made it walks out of the room. It goes to ground, it grows teeth, and it comes back wearing the face of a lie. The plaque was set that evening after all. Elara would not have it otherwise. With the roll torn, she read the remaining names from memory and from the copy the clerks had kept. For of course there was a copy. There is always a copy, and remember that it matters. And the household walked out into the quiet garden in the last of the light and set the bronze plaque at the head of the reflecting channel. And the 40 names lay in the sky-colored water. And it was, in the end, the thing the late queen had wanted. But there was a splinter in it now. Everyone who walked out to that garden was thinking of a raised fist and a torn roll, and everyone knew that the raised fist belonged to the Queen Consort's son, and everyone knew what that meant. It meant the house was about to divide. I did not sleep well that night. I lay in the guardsmen's quarters and turned the afternoon over and over, and the thing that troubled me was not the Lord's cruelty. I had seen cruelty before, but the ease of it, the practiced ease, the way he had walked in late and reached for the day as though it were already his. A man does not learn that in an afternoon. He learns it because someone, over years, has taught him that the house will one day be his to reach for. And there was only one someone in that house with the will and the reason to teach him so. I was right to lose the sleep, but I did not yet know how right. The lie came the next morning, and it came, as such things do, dressed for church. I was on the early watch at the east colonnade when I saw the Queen Consort Morwen across the inner court with her son at her shoulder and her daughter Lady Verena a pace behind, and I knew before they reached the door of the household chamberlain's office that the afternoon in the orangery was about to be rewritten. Morwenna did not walk like a woman whose son had disgraced himself. She walked like a woman who had been wronged. That is the tell if you ever want to know who is lying in a great house. Watch which of the two parties arrives first, and arrives certain, and arrives already grieved. The guilty party always gets to the story first, because the innocent are too busy being stunned. By the time I came off watch and into the guardroom, the story was already loose in the house, and it went like this. Lord Cassius, out of love and duty, had come to the memorial reading to prevent an error, the noble instinct of a careful man. He had raised a reasonable question about the list, in perfect courtesy. And the Princess Elara, overwrought with grief and unequal to the day, had flown at him, had struck at him, had torn the paper herself in a fit of temper, and had then set her aunt, and this was the poisoned heart of it, her guardsman * upon him. In this telling, Lord Cassius was the victim. He had been assaulted at a memorial. A common soldier of the guard, forgetting his place entirely, had laid hands upon a lord and threatened him, in front of the household, over nothing. And was that not, the Queen Consort asked, exactly the sort of dangerous indiscipline that the guard had lately fallen into? Was the house safe with men like that at its doors? You see what she did. She did not deny the scene. She could not. 40 people had watched it. She turned it inside out like a glove. Every true thing became its opposite. The taking became a defense. The tearing became Elara's own. And Havard, who had crossed a floor to put himself between a raised hand and a princess and a room of children, and had spoken 7 words and touched no one, Havard became the villain of it, the guardsman who had assaulted a lord. And here I must tell you the thing that made my blood run cold when I first understood it. She was not attacking Cassius's blunder. She was using asterisk it. Her son's disgrace was, to her, an opportunity, because if she could get the house to believe the guard had turned violent, that a common soldier had raised himself against a lord, then she could demand a reckoning of the guard as a whole. She could have Havard broken. She could have the captain replaced with a man of her own. And a queen consort who owns the doors of a house owns a great deal more than doors. The orangery had only been her son's clumsy little grab. This, the slow, patient turning of one guardsman into a threat, so that she might put her hand on the whole guard, was hers, and it was worth more to her than any torn list of dead servants' names. The captain of the guard was an old soldier named Osric, iron-gray, 30 years in service, a man who had held the line under 2 kings and did not frighten. He sent for Havard that same afternoon, and he sent for me, because I had stood the inner arch and seen it all, and he shut the door of his narrow office and looked at the two of us for a long moment before he spoke. "You know what's being said," he told Havard. "I've heard some of it, sir," said Havard. "They're saying you struck a lord." "I did not, sir." "I know you did not," Osric rubbed his jaw, "but it isn't about what I know. The Queen Consort has asked the Household Council to convene a hearing on the king's return. She wants you charged with striking a lord, with abandoning your post, with," he checked a paper on his desk with distaste, "with conduct endangering the persons of the royal household. That last is the one that hangs you because it's vague enough to mean anything. If the council believes her, you're broken out of the guard and you may be tried besides. Do you understand me, Havard? This is not a scolding. This is your name and your service, and possibly your liberty." Havard stood at attention through all of it and did not so much as swallow. "Yes, sir." "Then tell me what happened, all of it. And you," he turned to me, "you'll tell me after, alone, and I'll see whether the two of you tell the same tale or whether one of you is polishing it. Go on." So Havard told it, flat exact, in the clipped even voice of a man giving a report, no color, no self-defense, no flourish. Lord Cassius asked for the list. Princess Adela required him to bring it to her or be silent. He did neither. He took the list from Princess Elara's hand by force and it tore. He raised his hand behind Princess Adela. I placed myself between them. I said, "My lord, there are children in this room." He lowered his hand. He shoved me and left. I returned to my post. That was the whole of it, and it was, as I would confirm in my own telling 10 minutes later, exactly and word for word the truth. When Osric sent Havard out and questioned me alone, I gave the same account down to the 7 words, and I watched the old captain's face ease by a single degree, because 2 men who tell the identical truth under separate questioning are the most stubborn thing in the world, and he knew it. But then Osric said a thing that I have carried ever since. "It won't be enough," he said. "You know that both of you, 2 guardsmen telling the same story, she'll say you closed ranks. She'll say the guard covers for its own. And she isn't wrong that it usually does." He looked at me. "The council knows how a barracks works. Your word will be discounted before it's ever heard because you wear the same coat he does. If this comes down to the guard's word against a lord backed by the Queen Consort, the guard loses. It has always lost. That is the shape of the thing." I did not sleep that night either. Because he was right, and I have never in my life felt so bitterly the injustice of the shape of things. Havard had done the single most honorable act I had ever witnessed in that house, had risked his post and his liberty to stand between a raised fist and a princess, and a room of frightened children, and the very fact that he was a guardsman, the very uniform that had made the act possible, was going to be the reason no one believed him. His discipline was going to be recast as thuggery. His restraint, he touched no one, he raised no rifle, he spoke 7 words, was going to be waved away as the barracks closing ranks. The better his conduct had been, the more it would look like a story too clean to be true. And Havard knew it. That was the part that unmanned me. When the three of us were dismissed and Havard and I walked back to the quarters through the long stone corridor, I said something clumsy, something about how the truth would out, and he stopped and looked at me, really looked, which he rarely did, and he said, "The truth doesn't out, Alden. The truth gets carried asterisk, by people willing to carry it even when it costs them. If nobody's willing to carry it, it lies where it fell." And then he said the thing that told me what kind of man he truly was. It doesn't matter whether they believe me. It matters that I stood in the right place. If they break me for it, I'll have been broken standing in the right place, and that's a good deal better than the other way round. I have thought about that sentence for the rest of my life. The days before the king's return were the worst I have known in the house. The Queen Consort's version spread the way rot spreads through fruit, from the soft places outward. The junior servants, who took their cue from where the power seemed to be pooling, began to look at Havard sideways. A story went round the kitchens that he had gone at a lord like a madman. A lady of Morwenna's circle told it at a supper that Princess Elara had had a fit of nerves and made a scene of her mother's memorial, and that the poor loyal lord had been manhandled by the help. Each retelling filed off a little more of the truth and welded on a little more of the lie, until the thing walking around the house bore no resemblance at all to what 40 people had watched with their own eyes. And that is the terrible arithmetic of a great house, that 40 witnesses can be outshouted by one determined liar, if the liar has the higher chair. Worse, the witnesses began to be worked on. I did not see the first of it, but I heard of it, and then I saw plenty. The 40 souls who had stood in the orangery were not, most of them, great people. They were clerks and stewards and undersecretaries, people whose bread and roof depended on the goodwill of the house, and the house, in the king's absence, wore the face of the Queen Consort. And so quietly, one by one, they were reminded of that. Nothing so crude as a threat, a word here, a transfer there. The undersecretary who had stood nearest the lectern was suddenly needed at the Western estate and packed off within the day. An old clerk who had wept at the naming found his pension review, long overdue, suddenly moving, and was given to understand, gently, that a man with a fresh, clear memory of the afternoon and a man with a comfortable pension were, in the current climate, difficult to be at once. It was done so softly that no single act of it could be called a crime. But by the third day, when Osric quietly went to the witnesses to ask who would stand up at the hearing and say what they had seen, he found that the 40 had melted to a handful, and the handful were frightened, and the frightened do not make good witnesses. This is how the powerful win, not by disproving the truth, by making it too expensive to say. Princess Adela was not frightened, and Princess Elara was not for sale, and so the Queen Consort could not touch the 2 witnesses who mattered most, but she did not need to. She only needed to make them count for less asterisk. She let it be known through her circle that of course the 2 princesses would say what they said. They were the aggrieved parties. A woman defends her niece and a daughter defends herself. Their testimony was not evidence, it was family loyalty. And the guardsman, well, the guard defends the guard, everyone knows that. So in one clean stroke she had accounted for every honest witness in advance. The princesses were biased, the guards were biased, and the frightened clerks were silent. That left on her son's side the son's own word, and the word of his mother, and the word of his sister Verena, and the word of the 2 or 3 of Morwenna's people who had drifted into the orangery late, and would now swear to having seen the princess fly at the lord. 3 liars who agreed against a field of honest people who could be dismissed or silenced. It was going to work. I watched it day by day going to work. The midpoint of the whole affair, the moment the ground shifted under all of us, came from the smallest person in it. It was the 4th evening. Havard was off watch, and I found him in the small stone yard behind the guardhouse where the men go to be alone, and he was sitting on the mounting block with his bearskin off and his elbows on his knees, and for once he did not look like a monument. He looked like a tired man of 34 who was about to lose everything he had built and had decided not to complain about it. I sat down beside him, and neither of us said anything for a while. And then a small figure came across the yard in the dusk. It was Prince Torin, 11 years old in a plain coat, out well past the hour a prince of the house ought to be wandering alone, and he came straight to Havard and stood in front of him with the tremendous seriousness that children summon when they have decided to do a hard thing. "They're saying you hit Lord Cassius," Torin said, "in the kitchens and in the schoolroom. They're saying you attacked him and that Aunt Elara made it up." Havard got to his feet because a guardsman stands for a prince even in a stone yard in the dusk. "Your Highness should be indoors," he said gently. "They're lying," said Torin, and his voice cracked on the word, and I saw that the boy had been carrying this for 4 days and it had grown too heavy for him. I saw it, Bram saw it, Malin saw it. He grabbed Aunt Elara and tore the paper, and he lifted his hand at Aunt Adela, and you got in the way, and you said there were children in the room, and it's not fair that everyone's saying you did a bad thing when you did the bravest thing. You did the bravest thing, and now they want to punish you for it, and nobody will listen to us because we're only children." He stopped, out of breath, furious, near tears. And Havard knelt down in the stone yard so that his eyes were level with the boy's. The second time in a week I had seen that iron man break his own stillness, and both times for the same reason, the young ones, and he said, "Your Highness, listen to me. You are going to grow up to be a man of this house, and one day men will look to you the way they look to your father, and when that day comes you must remember tonight. You did not do a bad thing by seeing clearly. Seeing clearly is the hardest and most honorable thing a person can do, and it is the thing this house will most need from you. But I am a guardsman, and my duty is to stand in the right place and keep my mouth shut, and it is not your duty to fight my battle for me. Do you understand? Let the grown ones carry this. You keep the seeing, keep it safe. That's your part." Torin looked at him. "But what if the grown ones can't carry it?" And Havard had no answer to that, because it was the whole terrible truth of the thing, and a guardsman does not lie to a prince. But I did. I had an answer, and it came to me all at once, sitting on that mounting block, and it was the answer that saved everything, though I did not know that yet, because Torin's question, "What if the grown ones can't carry it?" had turned the problem over and shown me its underside, and on the underside was this: the Queen Consort had accounted for every witness she could see. The biased princesses, the self-serving guards, the frightened clerks. She had a story ready to discount every one of them. But she had not accounted for the 3 she could not imagine as witnesses at all, because in her whole cold reckoning of the house, it had never once occurred to her that anyone would call children to speak. Children were furniture to her, the way the guard was architecture. She had not silenced them, she had not needed to, she had not even seen them. And there was one more thing she had not accounted for, and Torin, without knowing it, had just handed it to me. Bram saw it. Little Bram, 6 years old, with his white rose. Bram, who at that moment was the least important person in the entire affair, and who, I suddenly understood, was carrying in his small hands the one piece of evidence that could not be discounted, transferred, pensioned, or frightened away. I need to tell you about the rose. You will remember that little Bram had been given a white rose to hold, cut from the late Queen's own bushes, at the start of the reading. A child of 6 does not put down a thing he has been given for a solemn occasion. He holds it and turns it over and holds it. And when Lord Cassius wrenched the roll from Elara's hands and the paper tore, half the names crumpled into the Lord's fist and he carried them out of the orangery, but not all of them stayed in his fist. I had seen a fragment flutter loose in the tearing, a corner of the torn roll and drift down, and I had not thought a thing of it in the chaos. But Bram had. Bram, who had been standing near the front with his rose, had seen a scrap of Aunt Elara's paper fall to the floor, and being 6, and being solemn, and having been taught that you do not leave the Queen's things lying about, he had picked it up, and he had kept it. It was still, 4 days later, folded inside the wrapping of his pressed white rose, in the nursery, because nobody had thought to ask a 6-year-old whether he had gathered up a piece of the very evidence that 3 liars were staking their story upon. I did not run to the nursery that night. I'm a guardsman. I do not run at things. But the next morning I went to Princess Adela, for it was her right and her duty, not mine, to act on it, and I told her plainly 3 things. That Prince Torin and Princess Malin and Prince Bram had all seen the whole of it and would tell the truth if asked. That a fragment of the torn roll, in Elara's own unmistakable hand, was very likely still in the nursery among Bram's things. And that the clerk's asterisk copy of the full list of names, the copy from which Elara had finished the reading, still existed and could be matched, tear to tear, against whatever fragments could be gathered. Princess Adela listened to all of it standing very straight by the tall window of her sitting room, and when I had finished she was quiet for a moment, and then she said a thing that I did not expect. She said, "No, Your Highness. No, Alden, not yet and not like this." She turned from the window. "Do you know what will happen if I march 3 children into a household hearing and set them against the Queen Consort's son? She will weep. She will say I have used the little ones as weapons, that I have coached them, frightened them, put words in their mouths for my faction's advantage. And half the council will believe her, because it is exactly the sort of thing a cornered faction does, and because it is easier to believe a scheming old aunt than to believe that a lord raised his hand to a woman over the names of the dead. If I bring the children first, I hand her the very weapon she needs to discredit them. No. The children are our strongest witnesses, and therefore they must be the last thing shown, and only after the ground has been so thoroughly prepared that their word falls onto belief already made, and not into doubt. Do you see the difference? Evidence in the wrong order is worse than no evidence. It inoculates. I did see it. It was the difference between a soldier and a general, and Princess Adela, God keep her, was a general. "Then what do we do first?" I asked. "First," she said, "we let her overreach. She always does. A schemer who is winning cannot stop reaching, and every reach is a place she can be caught. She has silenced the clerks. Good, let her think the field is clear. She will grow bold. She will make her charge against your guardsman as large and as public as she can, because she does not merely want him broken. She wants him made an example. She wants the whole guard to see what happens to a man who stands against her house. And in making it large, she will make a claim so specific and so false that we can break it on a single true fact. Then and only then, when her own words have narrowed to a point, we bring the fragment and the copy and the children. And it will not look like an aunt coaching babies. It will look like the truth arriving in its own time to answer a lie that has already been caught. She was right about the overreach. She was right about all of it. But before she could be proven right, the king came home 2 days early, and in a black temper, and knowing already that something had gone very wrong in his house while his back was turned. King Alaric was a big man gone gray, slow to anger and terrible in it, and he had ruled long enough to know that when a house is buzzing the way his house was buzzing as his carriage came through the gates, someone has been busy in the dark. I was on the gate watch when he arrived, and I saw his eyes go over the courtyard, over the servants who would not meet them, over the 2 eager faces of the Queen Consort's people who had come out to greet him with their story already loaded, and I saw him take the measure of it in a single sweep and give nothing back. He had learned stillness, too, though he had learned it in a harder school than the guard. Morwenna reached him first. Of course she did. I told you the guilty always do. She had him by the arm before he was well out of the carriage, her face already grieved, already wronged, and she was walking him toward the state apartments with her low, urgent voice pouring the story into his ear before his boots had warmed to the floor of his own house. The careful lord, the overwrought princess, the violent guardsman, the danger to the family, the necessary hearing. I could not hear the words at that distance, but I did not need to. I could read the shape of it in the way she leaned and the way he listened, unmoving, letting it come. And here I will say the one thing in this whole account that I did not expect, and that raised King Alaric forever in my regard. He listened to all of it, every word, all the way to the state apartments and behind the closed door. And then he did not act on it. He did not summon the guard. He did not send for Havard in a rage. He did the thing that only a truly wise ruler does with a story handed to him already grieved and already certain. He became suspicious of it precisely because it was so complete. A man who has ruled 40 years knows that the truth arrives ragged, in pieces, contradicting itself, told by people too shaken to make it neat, and that a lie arrives whole, polished, and pre-answering every objection. More when a story was whole. That was its flaw, and Alaric, whatever else he was not a fool about his own wife. So he did not cancel the hearing. He could not, without seeming to prejudge, and he was a scrupulous man. But he set its terms himself over Morwenna's objection, and the terms he set were these. It would be held in open council in the great hall before the assembled household, and not in some small chamber where a story could be managed. Every party would be heard, and he, the king, would sit it himself, and no one else would render the judgment. Morwenna had wanted a small, quiet reckoning of a guardsman, quickly done, before her husband could look too closely. Instead, she got a full court in the open, with the king on the seat of judgment. She had reached for a broken guard and been handed a trial she did not control. I saw her face when the terms were read out to the house, and it was smooth as ever, but I had watched her long enough to see the thing underneath, and the thing underneath was fear. The hearing was set for the third morning after the king's return, and the 2 days between were, I think, the strangest of the whole affair, because both sides now knew that everything would be decided in the open, and both sides spent those 2 days preparing entirely different things. Morwenna's people prepared a story. Adela's people prepared the truth, in the right order, exactly as she had said. And I, who had never in my life had a part to play beyond standing still at a door, found that I had a great deal to do. Because I was to be a witness, I was released from the watch, and I spent those 2 days at Princess Adela's direction gathering what she called the ground. First, the copy of the list. I went myself to the clerk's record room and drew out the fair copy of the 40 names, the one from which Elara had finished the reading, and I confirmed with my own eyes that it was intact, unmistakable, the whole roll of the late Queen's household in the clerk's careful hand. Second, the fragments. Here the affair turned again on the smallest person in it, and I want to set it down with the honor it deserves. I went to the nursery. The children's governess, a decent woman badly frightened by the atmosphere in the house, let me in with reluctance, and I asked gently in front of her, doing nothing in secret, whether Prince Bram still had the white rose he had been given at the memorial. He did. It was pressed flat in a book of pictures, wrapped in a twist of paper. And when Bram, very grave, unwrapped it for me, turning it over and over in exactly the way he had turned it in the orangery, a scrap of torn paper fell out from the wrapping and drifted to the nursery floor. I did not touch it. I called the governess to witness, and I called for a clerk to be sent, and only when there were 3 sworn adults watching did I lift the scrap. It was a corner of the roll, perhaps 2 inches by 3, torn on 2 edges and cut clean on 2, the very corner of Elara's roll of names. On it, in her own unmistakable hand, were 4 half-names, sheared through where the tear had crossed them. I had the clerk bring the fair copy, and there in the open, in front of the governess and the clerk and the 3 children, we laid the fragment against the copy, and the 4 sheared half-names matched exactly, the ink, the hand, the very letters, to 4 of the names on the roll. The scrap was a piece of Elara's roll. There was no arguing it, and a child of 6 had preserved it without being asked, because he had been taught not to leave the Queen's things lying about. I asked Bram before the same 3 witnesses 1 question only. Bram, do you remember where the paper came from? And Bram said, in the flat certain voice of a child stating an obvious thing, it fell down when the tall man tore Aunt Elara's paper. When the tall man tore Aunt Elara's paper, not when Aunt Elara tore it. 6 years old, and he had the sequence exactly, and no one in the world had coached him, because until that morning no one in the world had known the scrap existed. I brought all of it, the copy, the fragment, the sworn account of the finding, to Princess Adela, and she laid it out on the table before her and looked at it a long time, and then she said, "Now she overreaches. Watch." And Morwenna overreached. It came on the eve of the hearing, and it came because a schemer who is winning cannot stop reaching. Word came to us, from a servant loyal to Adela who had heard it in the Queen Consort's own apartments, of the exact charge Morwenna intended to lay in open court. It was worse than we had feared, and in being worse it was, as Adela had foreseen, the very thing that would break her. She did not intend merely to accuse Havard of striking a lord. She intended to accuse him of it with a wound to show for it. Lord Cassius would appear before the court with his arm bound in a sling, and would swear that when he reasonably questioned the list, the guardsman Havard had seized him, wrenched his arm nearly from its socket and flung him bodily from the orangery, and that the Princess Elara in her hysteria had torn the paper herself and then blamed the loyal lord to cover her guard's brutality. A bound arm, a visible injury, a specific, physical, provable claim. Do you see it? Do you see what she had done? In her hunger to make the case unanswerable, to give the doubters a asterisk wound to look at, so that no one could say it was merely word against word, she had committed her son to a single, concrete, checkable lie. Havard had touched no one. Every honest soul in that orangery had seen that Havard touched no one, that Cassius had shoved him twice, and that the guardsman had given half a step and no more. A wrenched arm was not a vague matter of tone and interpretation that could be argued forever. It was a fact, and it was false, and a false fact is the one thing in the world that the truth can walk right up to and knock down. "There," said Princess Adela softly, when the report was brought to her, and for the first time in the whole affair she smiled, a small, cold, satisfied smile, the smile of a general who has watched the enemy march his own army into the one place the ground could be made to swallow it. She has narrowed her lie to a point. Tomorrow we bring the truth to the point, and it ends. But it did not end easily, and it did not end the way I expected, and there was a moment in the great hall the next morning, I will come to it, when I was certain we had lost everything, when the whole carefully prepared truth seemed to turn to water in our hands, and it was saved in the end, not by the copy or the fragment or the children or the king, but by one man's refusal to say a single word he did not know to be true. The great hall of Harrogate was full to its walls the morning of the hearing. The whole household had been summoned, and the whole household came, the clerks and the stewards, the lords and their ladies, the servants pressed along the back, the guard drawn up in ranks down both sides. At the head of the hall the king sat on the seat of judgment, gray and heavy and unreadable, with Princess Adela on a stool at his right hand where a king's sister sits, and the crown Prince Rowan standing at his left. Below the dais, the two parties faced one another across the open floor. On the one side the Queen Consort Morwenna in deep mourning purple with her son Lord Cassius beside her, his arm in a white linen sling. On the other, Princess Elara, pale and composed, with the guardsman Havard standing at attention a little behind her, and myself behind him. The morning light came down through the high windows in long gray columns and lay across the stone floor between the two sides like a drawn line. The king's chamberlain read the charges, striking a lord of the household, abandoning an assigned post, conduct endangering the persons of the royal family, and then the new one, the one Morwenna had added in the night, the sharp point of the whole spear, grievous assault upon the person of Lord Cassius, to wit, the wrenching of his arm as evidenced. At the word evidenced, Lord Cassius shifted the sling on his shoulder, and a low sound went through the hall, and I saw the doubt spread across 100 faces like a shadow. A wound. There was a wound. It is a terrible thing, how a bandage will overrule 100 honest memories. Morwenna spoke first, and she was magnificent, I will grant her that, magnificent in the way a serpent is beautiful. She did not rage, she grieved. She spoke of her son's devotion to the house, his careful nature, his desire only to spare the family an embarrassment over a faulty list. She spoke of the tragedy of the day, the poor grieving princess unequal to her mother's memorial, the sad scene, the loss of composure. And then, with real tears standing in her eyes, I have never known whether they were true tears or summoned, and I have decided it does not matter, the effect is the same. She spoke of the moment the guardsman lost all discipline, seized her son, and did him this injury before the horrified house. I ask only this, she finished, turning to the king, to her husband, her voice breaking on exactly the right word, that this house be made safe again, that the men at our doors be men who know their place. My son bears the mark of what happens when they forget it. It landed. I felt it land. I looked along the ranks of the household and I saw the balance tip, saw the doubt harden toward belief, because she had a wound and we, so far, had only word, and the wound was standing right there in a clean white sling. Then Cassius gave his account, and it was well rehearsed and it was a lie from end to end, and he told it looking straight at the king, which takes a certain kind of nerve, and he described the guardsman's assault in vivid physical detail. The seizing, the wrench, the pain, the flinging out, while cradling the arm that told the story for him. And when he had finished, the king turned his heavy gray eyes to our side of the floor and said, in a voice like a stone being set down, "Princess Elara, you will answer." And Elara answered, and she answered well, and truthfully and clearly. The list was her mother's own. The Lord took it from her hand by force, it tore. He raised his hand to her aunt. The guardsman stepped between and touched no one and spoke 7 words and was shoved aside. She said it plainly and it was the truth, and I watched it fail to move the balance because, exactly as Adela had foreseen the moment Elara spoke, Morwenna's people murmured that of course she would say so, she was the aggrieved party, a daughter defending herself and her guard. It was not evidence, it was loyalty. Her true words fell into the doubt, already made, and were swallowed. And then Princess Adela spoke, and she was believed no better, for the same reason the biased aunt, and I began to feel the cold certainty of defeat rising in me, because we had the truth and we had prepared it and it was going down, witness by witness, into the pit Morwenna had dug in advance for every honest mouth. The king listened to it all unreadable, and I could not tell whether he saw through it or was being carried by the tide of it, and that not knowing was the worst thing of all. Then came the moment I told you of, the moment I was certain all was lost. The king turned his eyes to Havard and he said, "Guardsman, you are accused of striking this lord and doing him injury. Answer the charge." And before Havard could speak, Morwenna rose, swift, sure, striking at the exact instant of maximum danger, as a schemer does. "Sire," she said, "I would ask that the guardsman's account be given no weight at all, and I will tell the house why. This man is defended by his captain, by his fellows, by the whole guard, who close ranks around their own as every barracks in the realm has always done. His fellow guardsmen," and here she pointed one long finger straight at me, at Alden, standing behind Havard, "will rise in a moment and swear to whatever this one says, word for word, because they have had 4 days to make their story match, and men in the same coat always match their stories. I say their evidence is worthless. I say the only honest witnesses in that room were those with no stake in the guard, and every one of them," she let it fall soft and deadly, "will tell you they saw a princess lose her composure and a guardsman lose his discipline. Ask them. Ask the household. Where are the guardsman's witnesses, sire? Where are they? If 40 people saw what he claims, let them stand now and say it." And the hall was silent, because the 40 had been scattered and pensionied and frightened, and they did not stand, and the silence where they should have stood was the loudest thing in that hall, and it was damning, and Morwenna had timed it perfectly, and I felt the ground go out from under the whole cause. She had turned the very fact of our truth-telling into proof of conspiracy. She had turned the silence of the frightened into proof that there was nothing to tell, and she had done it in the one moment before Havard could answer, so that whatever he now said would sound like a rehearsed line in a barracks plot. This was the moment. This was the pit at the bottom of the whole affair. And I want to tell you what Havard did, because it was the finest thing I ever saw a man do, and it was also the simplest, and the two are more often the same than people think. He did not defend himself. He did not protest that he was honest. He did not point at me and say he will confirm it, which would have walked straight into her trap. He waited until the king, watching him closely now, said again, quietly, "Guardsman, answer the charge. Did you strike this lord? Did you wrench his arm?" And Havard said, "No, sire, I did not touch Lord Cassius at all." "He says you did. He wears the sling." "I know it, sire." "Then you call the lord a liar." And here every man in that hall leaned forward, because a guardsman does not call a lord a liar in open court before the king, and Morwenna's eyes glittered, because she thought she had him. Either he retreated and looked guilty, or he attacked a lord and looked exactly like the insolent brute she had painted. Havard did neither. He said, in the flat, even, unhurried voice he used for a report, looking not at Cassius and not at Morwenna but straight at the king, "Sire, I will not tell you what the Lord's arm is or is not. I did not see inside his sling, and I will not swear to a thing I did not see. I will tell you only what I did, because that I know. I crossed the floor. I placed my body between Lord Cassius's raised hand and Princess Adela. I said, 'My lord, there are children in this room.' He lowered his hand. He put both his hands on my chest and shoved me, and I gave half a step and held my post. He walked out. I laid no hand on him at any moment, sire, and I will swear that on my oath, on my service, and on my life, because it is the truth, and I will not swear to anything else, not to save myself and not to please this hall, because a guardsman's word is the last thing in this house that is supposed to be worth the breath it costs. If mine is worth nothing, then break me and be done. But I will not buy my safety with a single false word, sire. Not one." He stopped, and the hall was silent again, but it was a different silence now. It was the silence I told you about at the very beginning, the silence of a room full of people who have all stopped breathing at once, and it had turned, somewhere in the middle of what Havard said, from the silence of a man being condemned into the silence of a man being heard. Because, and this is the thing, this is the whole hinge of it, Havard had done the one thing a liar can never do. He had refused to claim more than he knew. Morwenna's story explained everything, answered everything, left no ragged edge, and Havard's did not. Havard would not even swear to what was inside the Lord's sling. He drew a line around the exact edge of his own knowledge and would not step past it for anything, not even to save himself, and every honest person in that hall, and there were more of them than Morwenna had counted, recognized in that refusal the unmistakable sound of a man telling the truth. A liar seizes every advantage. Havard had just left the largest advantage in the room lying on the floor untouched, because taking it would have meant swearing to a thing he had not seen. You cannot fake that. There is no counterfeit for it. It is the one coin in the world that only the honest can spend. The king looked at him for a long, long moment. And then King Alaric said slowly, "You will not swear to what is in the sling." "No, sire." "But you will swear you never touched him." "On my life, sire." "Then," said the king, and now his heavy gray eyes moved away from Havard, across the open floor, and came to rest on his own wife and her son with the sling, "let us see what is in the sling. For a man who will not swear to a wound he did not cause has made me curious about the wound." Morwenna moved at once to keep it from happening. A physician had examined her son, she said. A report existed. There was no need to distress the lord, but the king raised one heavy hand and the hall went still, and he said, "I did not ask for a report. I asked for the arm. A physician of my own choosing before this house now." And he named the old royal physician, a man who owed the Queen Consort nothing, and there was no road left for Morwenna that did not run straight into the king's flat command, and so the sling came off. The arm was whole. I do not mean it bore a lesser injury than claimed. I mean it was sound, unmarked, unbruised, unswollen, an arm that had never in its life been wrenched from anything. The old physician turned it this way, and that in the gray light for the whole hall to see, pressed it, bent it, and pronounced in his dry, flat voice that there was no injury present, none, nor sign of any that had healed, and that the arm had by every indication been perfectly well throughout. And the sling fell to the floor of the great hall, and with it fell the entire structure of the lie, because a lie built on a wound cannot stand once the wound is shown to be paint. I have watched a great many faces in that house. I never saw one change as Lord Cassius's changed then. He had staked everything on the sling, his mother had staked everything on it, because a wound could not be argued with, and now the wound was gone, and standing in its place, naked in the gray light of the great hall, was the plain fact that he had come before his king and sworn a physical, specific, checkable lie. Not a matter of tone, not a matter of interpretation, a false wound. And a man who will forge a wound will forge anything, and every soul in that hall understood in the same instant that if this was a lie, then all of it was a lie. The careful lord, the hysterical princess, the violent guard, all of it. The whole polished, seamless, ragged-edge-free story that had explained everything a little too well. And now the king wanted the ragged truth. "Princess Adela," he said, "you told me a guardsman stepped between a raised hand and yourself. You are my sister and I love you, and the Queen Consort has said your love for your niece makes your word worthless, so I will not take your word alone. Show me what a biased aunt has no power to invent. Show me the day." And Princess Adela rose, and now, at last, in the exact right order, onto ground so thoroughly prepared that it could bear the weight, she brought the truth. First the copy. She had the clerk lay the fair copy of the 40 names before the king, the intact roll of the late queen's household, plainly Elara's completed work, plainly no fraud, the honest record of 40 small honorable lives. The king read a few of the names aloud himself slowly in the silent hall, and the reading of them there was its own quiet rebuke to the man who had called them false to seize a ceremony. Then the fragment. She had me stand and give my sworn account of the finding. The nursery, the governess, the clerk, the pressed white rose, the scrap that fell from its wrapping, the 2 torn edges and the 2 cut edges, the 4 sheared half names. And she had the clerk lay the fragment against the copy before the king's own eyes, and the king leaned forward and matched them himself, letter to letter, tear to tear. And there could be no doubt, none, that the scrap was a piece of Elara's roll, torn across, and that half of that roll had walked out of the orangery in Lord Cassius's fist and half had stayed in Elara's, exactly as every honest witness had said, and exactly as the liar's story could not explain. For if Elara had torn the paper herself in a fit, as they swore, why had a corner of it fallen at the Lord's feet as he tore it away? And how had it come to be preserved by a child who plainly said, before 3 sworn adults, it fell down when the tall man tore Aunt Elara's paper? At the mention of the child the king looked up sharply and Morwenna seized it. "I told you she could not stop reaching, even drowning, and she cried out that there it was, the aunt had used the babies, had coached the little ones, put words in their mouths. This was exactly the corruption of a desperate faction. And it was the last reach and it broke her, because Princess Adela had built the ground for precisely this." "I have not brought the children, sire," Adela said, level and clear. "You will note that. I have brought a fair copy that any clerk can vouch, and a fragment found before 3 sworn adults, and the account of a guardsman who would not swear even to a wound he did not see. I have brought only things that cannot be coached. And the reason I have not led 3 children into this hall to be made weapons, sire, the reason I have kept them out of it from the first day, though they are the plainest witnesses in your whole house, is precisely so that the Queen Consort could not say what she has just said. I have given her no child to attack. Everything before you is cold evidence, and it all says one thing." She turned and looked at Morwenna, and her voice did not rise. "But since she asks for the children, since she has stood in your court and demanded them, let her have them. Not led by me, not coached by me. Let the king's own men bring them, and let the king himself ask them, and let this house hear what 3 children who were never touched, never frightened, never prepared, will say when a king asks them plainly what they saw." And the king said, "Bring them." They were fetched by 2 of the king's own household men, not by Adela's people, and they came into that vast silent hall, very small, Torin at 11 holding himself straight as a spear, Malin at 9 with her chin up in a way that was purely her Aunt Elara's, and little Bram at 6, who had been told nothing except that the king wished to speak with him, and who was, as ever, holding the pressed white rose, because a child of 6 does not put down a thing he has been given for a solemn day. And the king came down off the seat of judgment. That is a thing I had never seen. King Alaric rose from the seat where a king sits above his house, and he came down the 2 steps and crossed the floor and knelt, in his heavy robes, before 3 children in the middle of the great hall, so that his gray old eyes were level with theirs. And he did it, I understood, for exactly the reason Havard had knelt to Torin in the stone yard, because you do not tower over a small person from whom you are asking the truth. And he did not ask them a leading thing. He did not say, "Did the Lord tear the paper?" He said to Torin gently, "Tell me about that day. Whatever you remember, take your time." And Torin told it. Plainly a boy's account, exactly as it had happened, the grab and the tear and the raised hand and the guard stepping between and the 7 words and the shove and the walking out. And Malin asked the same, told the same in her own words, a different child's memory of the identical day. And then the king turned to Bram and he asked the smallest thing, the safest thing, the thing no one could call a coached answer. He pointed at the pressed white rose in the little boy's hands and he said, "That's a fine rose. Where did you get it?" "Aunt Elara gave it me," said Bram, "from grandmother the queen's garden. For the solemn day." And what happened at the solemn day? And Bram, 6 years old, holding his rose, in the plain, flat, certain voice of a child who does not yet know that grown people lie, said, "The tall man was cross. He pulled Aunt Elara's paper and it ripped and a piece fell down and I picked it up because you shouldn't leave the queen's things on the floor. And he was going to hit Aunt Adela, but the tall soldier got in the way and said there were children, and the tall man pushed the soldier, but the soldier didn't fall. And Bram didn't cry." A pause. "Torin did a bit." "I did asterisk, not asterisk," said Torin, with tremendous 11-year-old dignity, and a sound went through the great hall that was half a sob and half a laugh. The sound a room makes when it has been holding its breath for a week and is finally allowed to let it go, and in that sound the last of the Queen Consort's lie died, because there is no arguing with a 6-year-old who says Bram didn't cry and corrects his brother's blush. You cannot coach that. You cannot forge that. It is the truth in its own ragged, artless, unanswerable voice, and every soul in that hall heard it for exactly what it was. The king rose slowly from where he knelt. He took a moment, I think, to master himself, for he was not a man who wept in front of his house, and he was close to it. And then he sent the children out gently, thanking each by name, before he did what he had to do next, because whatever came now was not for young ears. He climbed back to the seat of judgment and he sat, and the whole hall waited, and when he spoke his voice had gone very quiet, which in King Alaric was more terrible than any shout. "A man came before me today," he said, "wearing a false wound and swore a false thing on it to break an honest guardsman and disgrace my daughter over the names of her mother's dead. He did not do it alone. A story that whole is never built by one hand. He did not look at his wife. He did not need to. The whole hall was looking at her for him. I will not hold a trial of my own household within a trial, but I have seen enough today to know the shape of a thing, and I am done being asked to mistake a serpent for a grieving mother in my own hall." He gave his judgments then, one by one, in the flat-weighed voice of a king who has made up his mind. Lord Cassius was stripped of his household offices and his place at court, and sent from the palace to a distant estate, there to remain until the king should summon him, which, the king said, and every man understood the weight of it, would not be soon. The false wound and the false oath were entered against his name in the household record, so that the lie would follow him as long as the record stood. You reached for a ceremony that was not yours, the king told him, over names you called false to make yourself large. You are smaller now than any name on that roll. Aldith Morrow kept the queen's linens 40 years and never lied to her king. You could not manage a single afternoon. Go. To the Queen Consort Morwenna he said less in words and more in fact. She kept her title, for a king cannot easily unmake a queen, and Alaric was a scrupulous man even in his anger. But he stripped from her that morning every office over the household she had gathered to herself in his absence, the keeping of the doors, the ordering of the servants, the say over the guard she had reached for through her son's disgrace. You wish to own the men at my doors, he said. You have shown me exactly why you never shall. Her hand over the house was broken in a single sentence, in open court, before everyone she had spent years teaching to fear her, and that, for a woman like Morwenna, was a harder blow than any exile. She stood through it smooth-faced and did not fall, and I will grant her that too. But she walked out of that hall with less than she had walked in with, and the whole house watched her do it, and the whole house remembered it, and that memory was the beginning of the end of her long shadow over Harrowgate. To Princess Elara the king said simply, "Your mother's names will be read again, in full, in the quiet garden by you, before the whole house, and I will stand at the reading. Let it be done as she wished, and let no one ever again call it false." And Elara bowed her head, and I saw a month of grief and a week of slander go out of her all at once. And then the king turned to Havard. The guardsman had stood through the whole of it at attention, motionless, eyes forward, the same fixture he had been at the garden door, a man who had been an hour from ruin and had not once broken his stillness before, during, or after. And King Alaric looked at him a long moment and said, "Guardsman, you were accused of laying hands on a lord. You were offered your safety in exchange for a single false word, and the false word was easy, and everyone in this hall would have understood you for taking it, and you refused. You would not swear even to a wound you had not seen. Do you know what you did standing so?" "I stood in the right place, sire," said Havard. "That is all." "No," said the king. "That is not all, and you will hear the rest, because a house that lets a thing like this pass unremarked does not deserve men like you at its doors." He rose, and the whole hall rose with him, and he came down off the dais a second time, twice in one morning, a thing unheard of, and he stood before the guardsman and said, so that every soul could hear it, "You crossed a floor you were forbidden to cross, to put your body between a raised hand and my sister and a room of my grandchildren, and you did it without touching the man, without raising your weapon, with 7 words spoken to give even him a door to leave by decently. And when they came to break you for it, you would not save yourself with a lie. There is no medal in my house worth what you did, but you will have the highest one there is, and you will have it from my own hand, and every guardsman in Harrowgate will stand to see it given, so that they know, all of them, that in this house the reward for standing in the right place and telling the truth is not ruin. It is honor. Let no man ever teach them otherwise again." And he had the highest honor of the house brought, and he pinned it to Havard's red tunic himself, there in the great hall, before the whole household and the whole assembled guard drawn up in ranks down both walls. And when it was done, the guard, without any order given, without a word, brought their rifles up in a single crash of salute to one of their own, and the sound of it went up into the high stone vault and hung there, and I have never in 19 years heard anything like it, and I never will again. Havard did not smile. He was not a man who smiled. But I stood close enough to see his eyes, and I will tell you what was in them, because I owe it to him to tell the truth about him to the last line, the way he told the truth to the king. It was not pride. It was something quieter and better than pride. It was a man who had been told, by the highest authority in his world, that the thing he had believed all along was true after all, that it had mattered where he stood, that the truth does not out on its own but gets carried, by people willing to carry it even when it costs them everything, and that he had been willing and had carried it, and it had come home. The names were read again, 3 days later in the quiet garden by Princess Elara, with the king standing bareheaded beside her, and the whole house gathered, and the bronze plaque at the head of the reflecting channel, with the 40 small honorable names cast into it forever. And Havard stood his post at the garden door, immaculate, motionless, eyes forward, a fixture, a piece of the architecture, exactly as he had stood the first day, as though nothing had happened, as though he had never crossed a floor in his life. But I knew what he had crossed. I had seen everything. That was why he wanted it set down, and why I have set it down, and why I have not softened one word of it. A man may stand still his whole life and never once be tested, and think himself disciplined. The discipline is not the standing still. The discipline is knowing, in the one moment it matters, exactly which floor to cross, and then telling the truth about it afterward plainly to a king, and not one word more than you know, though it cost you your place and your name and your liberty to keep it so. Havard crossed his floor. He told his truth, and a whole house learned from one silent guardsman who spoke only 7 words in the doing of it, that the man who does not move, and then moves at exactly the right moment for exactly the right reason, and will not lie about it after, is the strongest man in any room he stands in. He stands there still, at that garden door, keeping the quiet garden and the 40 names. And when I pass him on my rounds, I do not salute him, because a guardsman does not salute a guardsman on post. But in my heart, every time I do.